Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är gjord av Testbild och den fina loggan till podcasten är skapad av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om weird fiction-forskaren S.T. Joshi. S.T. Joshi har skrivit och redigerat och annotated, som det heter på engelska, kommenterat närmare 60 böcker om och av H.P. Lovecraft. Han anses av många vara världens främsta Lovecraft-forskare och han är således mest känd för sin 1000 sidor långa biografi om Lovecraft som heter I Am Providence. En fantastisk bok i 2 delar som jag läst flera gånger och är utan tvekan den bästa och mest innehållsrika boken om Lovecraft. Men Joshi har även skrivit om Ramsey Campbell och Lord Dunsaney samt boken The Weird Tale som behandlar de stora samtida författarna inom denna genre. Det är alltså M.R. James, Lord Dunsaney, Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen och Lovecraft själv då såklart. Weird fiction var alltså en term på det tidiga 1900-talet som var en sorts paraplyterm för det som senare skulle komma att genrebestämmas som skräck, science fiction och fantasy. Och ibland en mix av alltihopa. Sen finns det ju de idag då som skriver det som kallas the new weird. De är återupplivat och vill hålla liv i the weird tale helt enkelt. De påstår att weird fiction är en helt egen genre i sig och att det bara är det där riktigt skruvade och märkliga som kan genrebestämma en roman eller en novell som weird fiction. Jag har sett bilder på en väldigt ung S.T. Joshi med sina vänner redan på 80-talet i Lovecrafts hemstad. Så jag blev väldigt nyfiken på denna forskare, eller scholar som de säger på engelska. Vem var han och hur började hans intresse för weird fiction? How did your interest in weird fiction, and in particular Lovecraft, start?
Probably around the age of 10. Now, remember, I was an immigrant from India. My family moved here to the U.S. when I was about 5 years old. We settled in the Midwest, Illinois, and then Indiana. My parents were both professors, so, obviously I had an intellectual background, but amusingly enough, when I was quite young, I didn't really like reading at all. I wanted to play sports with my friends, American friends. I became Americanized very quickly. I came here actually not knowing English. So in a sense, in reality, English is my second language. My initial language was an Indian language called Marathi, which is spoken in the Bombay area. Anyway, so I had to learn English, and obviously at that age you learn very quickly. I was thrown into a kindergarten class and picked up the language quickly. But I did not really enjoy reading or really, or intellectual activity of any kind. And so at the age of 10, my older sister said, you need to start reading more books. So she took me to the public library in Indiana and just said, hey, pick out something, I'll check it out for you. Now, the funny thing is, one of the earliest things that really got me interested in reading was C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. Now, that's funny because, obviously, Lewis wrote those books to underscore his deep Christian faith, and the books are full of Christian symbolism. But I, being an immigrant, having literally no knowledge of Christianity, just read them as entertaining stories and entertaining fantasy works, and they entranced me. I read all 6 of those books and said, "Wow, this is great stuff." And reading is a lot of fun. Very quickly, though, I gravitated from fantasy to pure horror, supernatural horror. Initially, I started reading these anthologies that were edited by Alfred Hitchcock and Rod Serling. In fact, I'm not sure they actually literally edited those books. I think somebody else did it for them, but no matter, they bore their names. And those books were designed for young adults, and I found them very interesting. I'm pretty sure those books is where I first read stories by Poe and Ambrose Bierce. I don't believe Lovecraft was in any of them. However, what happened was that in the United States, there is a publisher called Scholastic Book Services. You may not know what that is, but this is a publisher that sells directly to students in what we call junior high school or high school, teenagers. I think you buy the books through your school and they send them to you. Very inexpensive paperback books at that time. We're talking about the early 1970s. you could buy a book for 95 cents, very inexpensive. So you could collect a lot of books this way. And I remember getting a book, and in fact I still have it, an anthology of stories called 11 Great Horror Stories. And the very last story in this book was the Dunwich Horror. Now, I can't quite specifically remember reading that story, but I know that I probably liked it. The name of the author stuck in my head because sometime later I was roving the shelves of my public library, and there I came upon these 3 volumes by H.P. Lovecraft. And I think something connected there. I said, oh, I read this author before, so let me see. Here are whole books by this writer. And so I checked them out and just fell in love. This would have been probably the age of 14 or 15, I think. And I have always maintained that is absolutely the perfect age, I think, to read Lovecraft, because it is at that point that your imagination is expanding. Also, you are gravitating, many young readers are getting more interested in, adult literature, moving away from just children's literature. And I was doing a lot of other reading at that time also, general reading, history, philosophy, novels. But these Lovecraft books simply entranced me. And I've never been the same ever since.
I've heard that you said that Lovecraft turned you into an atheist. Is that true?
Well, you have to understand that my parents are nominal Hindus. My mother much more devout than my father. My father actually was pretty much of a secularist. He wouldn't come out and actually say he was an atheist, but he never emphasized religion. And in fact, he urged my mother not to indoctrinate me and my 2 sisters into religious belief of any kind, either Hinduism or anything else. He felt that we needed to make up our minds by ourselves at a time when we were ready to understand what that really meant. It was not that we were dissuaded from religion. We had books about the various religions of the world in the house, and we were encouraged to read them. So I grew up basically without any inclination for religious belief. I didn't simply felt that it was not necessary to my life. So after I initially started reading Lovecraft's stories, I realized that a number of his letters had been published. At that time, I think 3 volumes of his selected letters had been published by Arkham House. And I asked my mother to see if she could get them from interlibrary loan, because they were not available at my local libraries, and I didn't have the money to purchase these books. And indeed, they came. This would have been about the age of 16 or 17, probably. And I read these books, the letters books, first 3 volumes, and they were fascinating, I'll tell you. And they just revealed such an interesting intellectual figure in Lovecraft. And of course, in those letters, he talks significantly about atheism. And I found the arguments very convincing. So in a sense, I really did become an atheist through Lovecraft.
My guess would have been that your first venture into horror and fantastic fiction would have been the Twilight Zone writers, like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont and people like that, rather than Lovecraft.
Well, those writers actually at the time were not very popular. Charles Beaumont actually, he had died in 1967, and I think went through an eclipse. There was not much discussion about him. Of course, right at this time is when horror literature became a best-selling phenomenon. First, you had Ira Levin with Rosemary's Baby, and then William Peter Blatty with The Exorcist, and then, of course, Stephen King. So we're talking about late 1960s into the 1970s. I don't know that I even read those books at that time, but horror, in general, was sort of becoming much more visible in the literary world. Now, the strange thing is that I was not greatly attracted or interested in horror in the media, that is to say, in films or television. I'm sure I watched Rod Serling's Night Gallery, no doubt, and The Twilight Zone, and found them very interesting. But I rarely went to movies at that time. It was just not something that I did. In fact, I remember the first movie I actually went to in a theater was Planet of the Apes, which was a spectacular experience, of course. And I was about the age of 14, I think, in 1972, something like that. A tremendous experience, but again, my family was just not accustomed to going to movies. It was just not something we did. So for a very long time, I really didn't do much with horror in the mass media.
So, what else did you read at the time? And when did you decide to become a writer yourself?
Well, yeah, I mean, I once I started reading, I said, this is fabulous. I absorbed as much literature as I could. I started becoming interested, again, through Lovecraft in part, through things like English history. I read a lot of English history, even when I was in high school, just for fun. It was entertaining to me. I read a lot of the Victorian novelists like Jane Austen and the Brontes. Not that came from Lovecraft. He wasn't interested in those. But I just felt at that time that I needed to get into serious literature. And I tell you, my nose was always buried in books. And of course, around the age of 14, I determined that I wanted to be a writer as well. And I started writing horror stories, mystery stories also. I should mention that the detective story was a big, big influence on me at that time. And I read a lot of detective stories throughout my early years. Agatha Christie, John Dixon Carr, many of those other writers. And I wanted to write detective stories as well. But then I, again, eventually moved over to horror.
Why horror? What was it about the horror story that captivated you?
It's hard to say. I mean, maybe I just like being frightened. There's something very visceral about the horror story, specifically the short story, because, I was not reading actually very many novels at that time. There actually weren't that many horror novels, really speaking, aside from these few bestsellers that Blatty and King were writing. The best horror fiction, I still maintain, is in the short story. And so I started reading a lot of these short stories: Poe, Bierce, Lovecraft, Arthur Machen, maybe even some Algernon Blackwood. I can't remember if I really read him that early, but I just feel that there was something extremely intense about a well-crafted horror story. It takes you into this whole imaginary world and grabs you by the throat. And as Lovecraft says, it is atmosphere really rather than the plot that carries you along. And the best horror stories have that function, and just got to me at that age. I mean, I don't know. You would have to conduct some elaborate psychological analysis of me, I suppose, to figure out why horror appealed to me over other things, but it always has.
Jeff Vandermeer says that a weird horror story works best in the short story format.
Oh, I believe that absolutely. In fact, the great majority of horror novels really are basically sort of crime or suspense novels with a little horrific interludes here and there. The emotion of fear, because it is so intense, it simply cannot be maintained over a long period of time. The human body, I don't think, can be horrified for hours at a time. It's simply too stressful psychologically, which is why, not only the short story, but the so-called novella, the 40, 50-page novella, which Lovecraft excelled at, as did Blackwood and many others, is, I think, the ideal vehicle for horror, because you can read that, in a sitting of about an hour, let's say, and that's about all you can endure in terms of the emotion of horror.
So what is horror to you? What type of horror story, or let's say, what elements in a horror story frightens you?
Oddly enough, I'm not sure I've ever thought about that. Lovecraft was, I think, a particular master of horror in landscape, in the natural world. I don't know that I'm frightened by people. I mean, a lot of horror stories are written about, serial killers or other unpleasant people of that sort. But that strikes me as pretty mundane. That's not all that different from just a crime or suspense novel story. But horror emerging out of the landscape is something that I find extraordinarily powerful, because I don't know that I myself have been in such landscapes, but every time I go into the forests here, we in the Northwest here, we have tremendously thick evergreen forests that have not, that seem to have been untouched by man since the dawn of time. There's a tremendously spooky atmosphere that emerges from them. The whole idea of something non-human is very powerful and strikes at the core of our supposed mastery of the world. It suggests that we are not, in fact, masters of the world, and we are insignificant excrescences upon the world and can be overwhelmed at any moment. So I think that is a very powerful element, and of course that's the secret of Blackwood's The Willows.
Do you have a favorite Lovecraft story?
Oh, I still rank at The Mountains of Madness as my very favorite Lovecraft story on a personal level, and I still maintain on an artistic level as well. The Shadow of Time, I think, is very close, maybe the second. These two stories indeed embody the cosmic element of Lovecraft better than any others. Not only the cosmicism of space, but the cosmicism of time. And now I realize also that, given my interest in history, I find that envisioning vast tracts of time going back into the prehistoric age or even to the dawn of the universe is also a fascinating and terrifying idea. And that's what these two stories in particular convey.
You also helped out with Lovecraft conventions and to put Lovecraft scholars from all over the world together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Two or three stand out. I helped to put on the H.P. Lovecraft Centennial Conference at Brown University in 1990. Now, that was a formal academic conference, but nonetheless, it was extremely gratifying that convention came off as well as it did. We arranged 5 or 6 panel discussions over 2 or 3 days, bringing in the leading scholars and students of Lovecraft from around the world. In fact, I remember a distinctive panel of European Lovecraft scholars from France and Germany and Italy, I believe, and perhaps elsewhere. And they shed incredible light on how Lovecraft was received in their countries. And I think that opened the eyes of a lot of people who were not aware of what worldwide interest there was in Lovecraft. And there was also a very touching ceremony as we unveiled a sort of a plaque or little monument to Lovecraft in the grounds of the John Hay Library that commemorated his life, and I helped to raise the funds for that also. There was another convention a good many years later, back in 2011, a man named Adam Nicewander, who unfortunately has died since then, put on a convention called MythosCon in Phoenix, and that was an incredibly exciting convention because that attracted not only scholars of Lovecraft, but also some of the leading writers of contemporary Lovecraftian fiction. A lot of good writers came to that convention, and that, to hear their take on Lovecraft, to see how Lovecraft had inspired them in their own work, was also very thrilling.
Have you met any other interesting Lovecraft scholars during the years?
I think one of the leading scholars on Lovecraft, very little known at this moment, is a Finnish scholar. He lives in Finland, named Juha-Matti Rajala, a brilliant scholar. It's amazing how much he can accomplish in terms of understanding the primary documents all the way out in Finland. But he does. He's a fine scholar, and I hope he can come to the next Necronomicon convention. This is the convention that's put on every 2 years in Providence, Rhode Island, and we're looking forward to the convention in 2017. There still are good scholars out there. Lovecraft is getting into the academic arena more and more. Professors here in the United States are taking an interest in Lovecraft, and certainly there's always been interest in France. France has a lot of academics who find Lovecraft very interesting. So there's still a lot to be done.
I'll do this part in English. One part of the old Joshi interview got deleted by mistake, and in there is one piece that I wanted to keep. When I asked ST that since his research into Lovecraft was so extensive, I guess he covered almost everything that's likely to be known from his letters. Is there anything left? ST answered that the issue with Lovecraft and his sexuality was still a mystery, since Lovecraft was such an asexual person. The other thing that interested ST was deeper insight into his thoughts on science and literature. What did you think about the first Lovecraft biography by L. Sprague de Camp?
It's hard for me to be objective about that biography because my biography was expressly written to sort of replace it. De Camp did about as well as anybody could, I think, writing this biography in the early 1970s, where not nearly as much was known about Lovecraft as we know now. I mean, DeCamp certainly spent a lot of time at Brown University reading through letters and other documents. But I think he also was not really sympathetic to Lovecraft. He didn't really understand Lovecraft's views or sympathize with them, especially his views of being an amateur writer. Lovecraft really was never a professional writer and didn't want to be a professional writer because writing meant too much to him. He didn't want to make it a source of his income because he felt that would be a corrupting influence, and I think he's right about that. But DeCamp was a prototypical professional writer. Everything he wrote for money, and so he simply couldn't understand the mindset of someone like Lovecraft. And he didn't know enough about philosophy to understand Lovecraft's philosophical vision, and so he hardly even talks about that subject. But you have to talk about it if you want to know, why Lovecraft even wrote at all, because all his work is infused with this philosophical vision, this cosmicism that was the central pillar of his thought. And of course, there are all manner of factual errors that some of them are frankly inexcusable. Others are just a result of the level of knowledge at that time. The work was important in the sense that it was published by a major publisher and brought a lot of attention to Lovecraft at the time. It was reviewed very widely in the American press here, and sold pretty well. So it did help to raise Lovecraft's image in the literary world. But there was definitely a need for somebody to write a more comprehensive one, and I was lucky to have the opportunity to do that about 2 decades later.
Yes, but when DeCamp wrote it, there was still a lot of Lovecraft's friends alive, so he had the privilege to interview them for it.
Oh, by all means. He was quite diligent in tracking down Lovecraft's colleagues, and there were many of them at the time, people like Robert Bloch and Fritz Leiber, and less obscure, less well-known people who, actually had met Lovecraft. He himself said he didn't plan to write his biography until August Derleth died. Derleth was in the process of writing a biography, which frankly would probably have been even worse than DeCamp's, because Derleth was not really trained to write biographies.
A book that I really like, that is not very well regarded, is Lovecraft's best friend, Frank Belknap Long's biography about Lovecraft. That's called Dreamer on the Night Side.
Frank only wrote that work, and he didn't claim that it was a biography. It was really an extended memoir, but he only wrote that work because when he started reading DeCamp's biography in manuscript, DeCamp would send him chapters of his book. Frank was so offended by the what he felt was the untrue, inaccurate portrait of Lovecraft that was emerging from DeCamp's biography that he felt the need to write a sort of an antidote, as it were. And so he wrote that book apparently very hastily, only in a few months. And at that time, yes, I think Frank had forgotten a lot of what he knew about Lovecraft. He was in his 70s, and already his health was failing. So he just sort of threw this book together. I don't know the specifics about the editing of it, but when he submitted it to Arkham House, the editor then was a man named James Turner, who has died. He died in the 1990s, but Turner did tell me that he had to do a fairly extensive rewriting of that book. I wouldn't say he wrote it totally from scratch, but he had to do a lot of, reshuffling of the book and just trying to get it into some sort of coherent shape because it was rather carelessly written at the time. It is a disappointment, to be sure, but, he just wanted to get it out there to say, this is my view of Lovecraft, which is very different from DeCamp's view.
Well, he couldn't have completely rewritten it. I mean, it still has to be Frank's memories of his friend.
I believe it has to be, because obviously James Turner would not have had any personal knowledge of Lovecraft. But yeah, I mean, and Frank, let's be honest, Frank was sometimes a little careless as a writer. I myself later on then commissioned Frank to write his own autobiography. We published it by Necronomicon Press, autobiographical memoir, and I'll tell you. It was a rather skimpy piece of work, and I think that the latter parts of it he submitted as a handwritten document, and it took me some effort to transcribe that text to get it to some sort of coherent shape. It's just called Autobiographical Memoir by Frank Belknap Long. Came out in the late 1980s, probably, maybe early 90s. I've forgotten, but it's out there. It's a slim pamphlet, not terribly interesting. Again, by this time, Frank was very old and simply didn't remember very much. I wished it had been. I wished he had said more, but he had just either forgotten or didn't care to say more about himself. So it was somewhat of a disappointment.
Apart from Lovecraft, you're also a great admirer of the great fantasy writer, Lord Dunsaney.
All his prose, in my humble estimation, I think he is one of the great prose stylists in the whole realm of English literature. And I think people misunderstand the kind of prose he wrote. He didn't actually write that kind of very dense, adjective-laden prose that Lovecraft wrote. In fact, that is why most of Lovecraft's Dunsanian imitations don't work well, because he actually misunderstood how Dunsaney achieved his effects through prose. His prose, even at the very early stages when he was writing these stories of pure fantasy, is quite simple on a syntactic level. Where Dunsaney excels is this incredible use of symbol and metaphor. It is difficult to describe unless you actually can quote a passage, but it is that prose that I find absolutely hypnotic. Otherwise, the strange thing is I'm not actually interested in the genre of fantasy, which is what Dunsaney specialized in. I mean, I've read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings several times, but never really struck a chord in me. I've only just now, incredibly enough, started reading Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy, but again, I'm sorry to say it's not terribly interesting to me. Maybe I'm actually focused so much on the real world, I have trouble envisioning a realm of pure fantasy. And Dunsaney indeed abandoned that approach that he had used in his first few books, and moved on to a methodology whereby he incorporated fantasy into the real world, and I think that created some of his best stories. Things like A Dreamer's Tale, or even things like The King of Elfland's Daughter, nominally set in a fantasy world, but again, it's reality, it's tactile. Reality is very clear to the reader.
Lovecraft var besatt av Dunsaney och satte honom i första rum som mästaren med en prosa som knäcker alla andras. Dunsaney var allt som Lovecraft önskade att han var. Lovecraft var och såg ett seminarium där Dunsaney talade, men han var för blyg för att gå fram och prata med honom efteråt. Vid ett tillfälligt rus av storhetsvansinne och frustration uttalade sig Lovecraft: I am Dunsaney! You were at the Dunsaney Castle with Swedish Martin Anderson and did some research. Can you talk about that?
As I say, one of my great interests is Lord Dunsaney, and of course I came to Dunsaney from Lovecraft, and I was thrilled to go to Dunsaney Castle in company with Martin Anderson for about 2 weeks I think in summer of 2014, and we helped to catalog Dunsaney's papers and manuscripts. It was a fascinating undertaking, and I think we did pretty well at it. There's lots of work to do on Dunsaney. I think he's a much underappreciated writer, and I hope to get more work by Dunsaney out there. In fact, I have assembled a volume of his complete plays. He wrote many, many plays, about 50 plays or so, and this book will be about 1,000 pages probably. But I want to get those plays out there because I think they are wonderful pieces of writing, and I hope to get other work by Dunsaney reprinted as well.
There still isn't a proper biography written about Dunsaney. I've heard that there was a biography written during the 70s and that it wasn't any good. Could that be the next thing for you to get into now after Lovecraft?
The Dunsaney family, the estate, still living in Ireland, of course, commissioned this writer, a British writer named Mark Amory, to write a biography back in the early 1970s, and he did so. He published it in 1972, but I feel it is a pretty inferior piece of work. It does not appear as if Amory really even liked Dunsaney very much. It's not a well-done biography and needs to be completely done from scratch. But who would ever do that is a mystery, because the information you would need, the documents and letters and things, are at Dunsaney Castle in Ireland, and somebody would have to spend weeks there poring over this material and doing all sorts of other background work. It's a major undertaking, and I hope somebody will do it. I'm not sure I'm quite up to the task, but I'm always hopeful that somebody else might do it.
You have compiled volumes of contemporary Lovecraftian horror writers in several books called Black Wings of Cthulhu.
In 2007, I compiled an anthology for Penguin, called Penguin Classics, called American Supernatural Tales. Now, this was an historical anthology going all the way back to Washington Irving and then up to the present day. And I was actually not all that familiar, really speaking, with many of the leading contemporary writers of today, because most of my research has been on past writers. But I received some advice from a colleague who says, well, there's a particular writer named Caitlin Kiernan you really ought to consider. And she sent me some stories, and there was one particular story which ended up being Black Wings 1 that I thought was spectacular. And I said, wow, she's a great writer. And of course, in my research on Lovecraft, I had become acquainted with some of the other writers who were writing contemporary Lovecraftian fiction, people like W.H. Pugmire and some other writers. So I realized that I had a cadre of writers who could do a pretty interesting anthology of original fiction in the Lovecraft vein. There were a number of anthologies of that sort starting to come out, and I said, well, why can't I do one? Now, the interesting thing is that I assembled this volume specifically for Arkham House, because at that time, Arkham House was still, a leading small press. They had published, of course, my corrected editions of Lovecraft, so I figured they might be interested in this book. And they had not published a book for a while. They were going through some sort of difficulties, apparently. And so I naively felt that this book might help them to resurrect their fortunes, because it would take them back to their roots in terms of publishing Lovecraft-related material. Well, Arkham House sat on this book for about 6 months and made no decision. And I finally said, well, I need a decision here. I can't have you sit on this forever. It's unfair to these authors who have written these original stories that, if they don't know what the fate of their work is. So I said, I'm sorry, I have to take the volume away if you can't make up your mind. So then I was sitting on this book, which I thought was a very good book, and I said, well, where should I go now? And I can't remember how I came upon PS Publishing. Maybe somebody recommended it to me, but I sent a message to the editor of PS, Pete Crowther in England, and all I did was say, I have an original volume of stories in the Lovecraft vein, and here are the authors and the titles of the stories. And almost by return mail, or email, of course, he said, yes, I want this book. He did not even read the book. Apparently, I'm flattered to think that my reputation, and also the reputation of some of the authors I had in this book, Caitlin Kiernan, Laird Barron, a number of other important writers, convinced him that the book was good enough and saleable enough to publish. And sure enough, it came out in 2010, and now I've just finished my 6th volume in that series.
When I met you in 2014 at a Lovecraft festival in Portland, you said that you had gotten a mission to annotate Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow in 1 week or something like that.
Oh, that when that television show True Detective came out, the first season, it had all sorts of covert references to Chambers. I think they talked about Carcosa, Hali, the King, maybe even mentioned the King in Yellow or the Yellow Sign. I can't simply remember. Anyway, so there was this huge Chambers boom all of a sudden. He was everywhere, and people wanted to read this famously obscure book. So a friend of mine, in fact, the same friend who had recommended Caitlin Kiernan to me years before, Stefan Zimanowicz, he is an editor at Barnes & Noble Publishing in New York, said, okay, we need to get out an edition of Robert W. Chambers' King in Yellow immediately to capitalize on this sudden interest. Can you do this annotated edition in 1 week? And I said, well, maybe. In fact, I did. It took me exactly 6 days to prepare this edition. Now, I have to admit that I relied on some past work I had done on Chambers. I had written a lengthy article on Chambers some years before, because, of course, I was quite familiar with Chambers' writing. Back in 2000, I had published a huge collection of Chambers' complete weird writings called The Yellow Sign. So I was very familiar with Chambers, and the annotation process wasn't extremely difficult. There was not all that much to annotate, really speaking. But I think I shed some light on not only on the King in Yellow stories, but the other stories in the latter half of that book that actually are not horror stories, but are quite good stories mostly about the Franco-Prussian War, set in France for the most part. And then I wrote, and I managed also to find some original reviews of that book in English and American magazines, and I think a lot of that has not been seen before. So yes, it took me exactly 6 days to publish, and the book came out in about a month. Instant publishing.
Have you ever written something that you completely changed your mind about afterwards?
I had written a chapter on M.R. James for my book, The Weird Tale, back in 1990. And I was rather harshly critical of James because I felt that his ghost stories were both were backward looking. They didn't really advance the genre any. I mean, he basically was the culmination of the English ghost story. And I didn't find James himself all that interesting an individual. But then, about 15 years later, Penguin Classics asked me to edit the ghost stories of M.R. James. And I felt, well, I'm really not an authority on James. There are many others who could probably do much better, but the Penguin, trusted me to do a good job. So I finally started doing some further background research in James. There are two very interesting biographies about James, both quite different in their approaches. One focuses on his scholarly work as a scholar of biblical manuscripts and things like that. The other focuses more on his personal life and his ghost stories, and I found them both illuminating, and I found James much more interesting as an individual and as a thinker than I did before, and as a result, my opinion of the stories substantially increased. I realized a very high level of craft in these stories. And of course, I did further research. I found that James had written some very early stories in his college years and things like that, and I stuck those in an appendix. See, of course, he had written some very interesting essays, the ghost story, so I put those also in an appendix. So James was quite a revelation. I have a much higher opinion of him now than I used to.
What contemporary writers fascinates you today?
Is that there are a lot of good writers out there, and they're taking the genre into very interesting directions. I mean, I can just rattle off people like certainly Caitlin Kiernan. I hope Laird Barron is doing good work. I've been disappointed in some of his later writing, but nevertheless, he's a very talented writer. I've promoted some writers who have sort of come under my wing, like Jonathan Thomas, Michael Aronovitz, a number of others. But in my humble estimation, the Lovecraftian vein may actually be sort of I wouldn't say coming to an end, but I think we've sort of reached a certain limit in terms of what people can do with the Lovecraft element. In fact, I've just compiled Black Wings 6, and I'm going to take a break now from that series because I think we need to promote other types of work. And some of my standard authors have said I have nothing more to say in that particular idiom anymore. One of the threads that I find very interesting is finding horror in technology. In some sense, this is crossing over into a little bit of science fiction. Ramsey Campbell actually has done a good bit of that himself. One of his most memorable stories from the 1990s was a horror story about a cell phone. And it was quite terrifying. Things like that. I think the modern age, the contemporary age, is so full of. We're so wired. We're so full of gadgetry that it's, in a sense, redefining what it is to be human, especially with the development of robots and artificial intelligence and things like that. That's a very fertile field for horror. In fact, I am now hoping to compile an anthology called Future Weird, which will be horror stories sort of intersecting with science fiction. And of course, Lovecraft was a great pioneer of that himself in his day. So that's one thread that I think is very promising. There's a lot of great weird fiction being written out there. Unfortunately, most of it is in this small press, so you have to make some effort to seek it out. The big publishers don't really do a lot of horror these days because it's simply not that marketable. We don't have the big best-selling writers anymore, and I think actually that's for the better. Horror can enter into almost any aspect of human life. That's why it's almost misleading to refer to it as a genre. It's not really a genre. I mean, it can be very close to mainstream fiction sometimes. It can draw upon elements of the mystery and detective story, the science fiction story, the fantasy story. All these things can work their way into what we consider to be a horror story or a weird tale. I will just mention, I'm still devoted to unearthing the classics of older weird fiction. I have two different series going on simultaneously. One is with Centipede Press, which is another fine small press in this field. Unfortunately, their books are quite expensive, hardcover editions and small print runs. But nevertheless, I'm doing a series called the Centipede Press Library of Weird Fiction, in which I hope to include large selections of the leading weird writers from the past, going all the way back to Poe, Lovecraft, Dunsaney, Machen, Bierce, Blackwood, Bram Stoker, and a number of others. So those books are in the process of coming out. Another press called Dark Renaissance Books is doing a smaller volumes of classic weird fiction, in which I'm reprinting the work of writers like E. Nesbitt and W. Jacobs, who wrote The Monkey's Paw, but wrote a lot of other weird work as well. And actually, Centipede Press is about to issue a 2-volume edition of the collected Robert Aikman, which I have edited, and I hope that gets out there, because Aikman really is another master. He's, in a sense, a sort of precursor to Ligotti, in that he focuses on what he calls strange stories. He doesn't write horror as such, but just he teases out the strangeness in human life in a way that is very distinctive.
I've read the Robert Aikman story, The Hospice.
Extremely creepy story. In fact, I think it was even made into a short film, about 20-30 minute film. There could be more films of his stories made. That is certainly one of his great ones. I think there's a story called Ringing the Changes that is an absolute classic of weird fiction. One of the best horror stories ever written in the 20th century.
What contemporary writers fascinates you today?
Well, Laird Barron, I hope I'm not immodest in saying that the story he wrote for Black Wings 1, called The Broadsword, is perhaps still his best story. A tremendously powerful story about strange events in a hotel up here in the Northwest. I think, in fact, might actually be set in Seattle or Olympia, which is a town nearby, our state capital. Barron lived there for a good many years, but tremendous atmosphere of terror in that story. And his novel, The Croning, I believe that came out in 2012, is a fine piece of work, a sort of mingling of themes out of Lovecraft and Arthur Machen and other writers, but also a very original work in his own right. And I found that a very compelling piece of writing. It took him a long time to get that novel finished. He had a lot of trouble with it, but I think it came out quite well indeed. As for Caitlin, there's so much she has written. I think she still does her best in the short story. She has a fine array of story collections. I think the Ammonite Violin has a great stories in it. Some of her novels are very powerful too. I particularly responded to a novel called The Red Tree, which is set in New England, in fact, in Rhode Island. She lives in Providence, Rhode Island right now, which is, of course, was Lovecraft's home, and there are some subtle Lovecraftian elements in that novel, but really it's fundamentally an original piece of work. And I understand now it is being made into a film, a feature-length film, which ought to be very, very promising. She has a tremendous output. She has, a dozen or so novels and as many short story collections. She's, in a sense, as prolific as Ramsey Campbell, who has written many books, too many to mention here.
Can you talk about your own fiction? You have written a fictional story where H.P. Lovecraft is the central character. It's called something like The Assaults of Chaos.
Oh, that novel is what the French call a jeu d'esprit. It was a bit of a joke. It's called The Assaults of Chaos, still available from Hippocampus Press. I wrote that whole book as a sort of tribute not only to Lovecraft himself, who is the central character in the book, but also to my own love of weird fiction. So I have, I wouldn't say cameo appearances, but in fact more substantial appearances by Blackwood, Dunsaney, Machen, Hodgson, Bierce. It was just a piece of fun. I will mention that I have written also 2 detective novels, not Lovecraftian, of course, but those are available from Wildside Press. I actually have very much enjoyed the detective story. I read detective stories from childhood onward, and I have written a book about the detective story. I write fiction more or less as a recreation rather than as any serious undertaking. So no need to take it very seriously.
You've also written a very good book called The Weird Tale, about the golden age of weird fiction, and where we talk about these authors, M.R. James, Lord Dunsaney, Algernon Blackwood, and H.P. Lovecraft. How did you come about writing that book?
I'll tell you that one comment about Lovecraft that I have always struck me as very true is when Robert Bloch, a young writer who came in touch with Lovecraft when he was a teenager, he said, "Lovecraft was my university." And what he meant by that was that just through corresponding with Lovecraft, Bloch became interested in so many other things that he might not have known about were it not for his these letters he got from Lovecraft. And in some ways, I feel the same way. When I read supernatural horror literature, when I read Lovecraft's letters, I become interested in all these other things that he was interested in that I would have not have known about. So in a sense, that book, The Weird Tale, was my attempt to, I wouldn't say rewrite, but to perhaps update Lovecraft's own treatise on supernatural horror literature, especially his last chapter on the modern masters, where he talked about Blackwood and M.R. James and Dunsaney and Machen. And so I chose those 4 to write about. I wanted to give my interpretation of them, along with Lovecraft himself, and then Ambrose Bierce, who I felt was also an important figure. So that book, in a sense, is structured, by my interest in Lovecraft, even though there's only 1 chapter about Lovecraft in there. And I found these writers to be compelling, extremely compelling. And so I actually ended up obtaining nearly their entire work and reading their whole work in a way that I don't think has been done before. And I found this incredibly illuminating, but I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't first studied Lovecraft.
Så, det här avsnittet blev extra långt på grund av att jag tyckte det var så intressant att höra hur en person som har spenderat så stor del av sitt liv med att forska på ett enda ämne, weird fiction, och i princip då mest på en enda person, H.P. Lovecraft. Ja, det var allt för den här gången. Jag heter Henrik Möller. Musiken är skriven av Testbild. Hej då!